The porch light was still broken. That was the first thing Eli Marsh noticed when the taxi pulled away and left him standing at the end of a gravel driveway he hadn't walked in 6 years. The same flickering yellow bulb, the same moths circling it like they'd never left either. He almost laughed. Some things in Cedar Hollow simply refused to change, and right now, with his suitcase handle sweating in his palm, he was grateful for that. He hadn't planned on knocking on this particular door tonight. He'd told himself he'd unpack first, see his mother, maybe sleep off the 12-hour drive before facing anyone from his old life. But his feet had carried him 3 streets over instead, past the church, past the diner with the flickering open sign, until he was standing in front of a house that still had the same crooked mailbox, the same wind chimes, the same silence pressing in around it. And then the door opened before he could even raise his hand to knock, and there he was. Julian Reyes stood in the doorway in a gray t-shirt and bare feet, hair damp like he'd just showered, and for a full 3 seconds neither of them said a single word. The porch light buzzed. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Eli felt something crack open in his chest, wide and sudden, like a door he'd nailed shut a long time ago had just been kicked in. "You're supposed to be in Chicago," Julian said finally, voice low and rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "I was," Eli said. "I'm not anymore." Julian didn't move. He just stood there, one hand braced against the doorframe, looking at Eli like he was trying to solve a math problem that didn't add up, like the years hadn't erased anything, like Eli had just stepped out for coffee instead of vanishing for 6 years. Then, without a word, he reached out and pulled Eli into a hug so tight it knocked the air out of him, and for one dizzying second, with his face pressed into the curve of Julian's neck and Julian's heartbeat hammering against his own chest, Eli forgot every single reason he'd had for staying away. "I missed you," Julian murmured into his hair, so quiet it barely qualified as sound. "I missed you so much it was stupid." Eli closed his eyes. He didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice not to break. They pulled apart too fast and stood there in the doorway, suddenly awkward, suddenly 17 again, 2 boys who used to know every single thing about each other and now weren't sure where to put their hands. Julian rubbed the back of his neck. Eli stared at a spot somewhere over his shoulder. "You want to come in?" Julian asked. "Or are we gonna stand here till the neighbors start talking?" "They already talk," Eli said. "Might as well give them something good." That got a laugh out of Julian, a real one, the kind that used to fill up whole afternoons back when they were kids sneaking onto the roof of the old grain silo to watch the sunset. It hadn't changed. Nothing about Julian's laugh had changed, and that terrified Eli more than anything else about coming home. Inside, the house smelled like cedarwood and something faintly of cooking oil, and Eli realized with a small jolt that Julian was living alone. No roommate's shoes by the door, no second coffee mug in the drying rack. Just Julian, in a house too big for one person, exactly the way he'd said he never wanted to end up. "You live here now?" "Like, actually live here?" Eli asked, setting his suitcase down by the couch like his body had made the decision before his brain caught up. "Bought it last year," Julian said, disappearing into the kitchen. His voice carried back easily, the way it always used to when they'd talk through walls, through phone lines, through the 300 miles that had eventually swallowed their friendship whole. "Needed somewhere that was mine." "You want a beer or are you still doing that whole, I only drink craft stuff from Chicago thing?" "That was one time and you will never let it go." "Never," Julian agreed, coming back with 2 bottles, offering one like a peace treaty. "So, you gonna tell me why you're standing in my living room at 10 at night instead of texting me like a normal person first?" Eli took the bottle. His fingers brushed Julian's for half a second too long, and he felt it, actually felt it, a small electric pulse traveling up his arm and settling somewhere behind his ribs, and he hated how much that scared him. "Things ended in Chicago," he said carefully. "The job. Everything, honestly. I needed somewhere to think." "And you thought of here?" Julian's eyes stayed on him, steady, unreadable in the low lamp light. After 6 years. I thought of you, Eli said, before he could stop himself. The room went quiet in a way that felt loud. Julian set his beer down on the coffee table without drinking from it, and for a moment his jaw tightened, like he was working through several different things he wanted to say and discarding all of them. You could have called, he said eventually, and there was something underneath the words, not anger exactly, but something bruised, something that had been carrying weight for a long time. 6 years, Eli. Not a call. Barely a text on your birthday, and even that stopped. I know. Do you? Because from where I was standing, it felt like you just. Julian stopped himself, dragged a hand down his face. Never mind. You're tired. It's late. We can talk about the ancient history some other time. But Eli didn't want some other time. Some other time was exactly how they'd lost 6 years in the first place. I left because I was scared, Eli said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, steadier than he felt. Not of Chicago. Of here. Of this. He gestured vaguely between them, and immediately regretted how small and insufficient the gesture was for everything it was trying to hold. Julian's eyes flicked up to meet his, and something in them shifted, sharpened, softened, Eli couldn't tell which. This, Julian repeated slowly, like he was testing the shape of the word in his mouth. What's this, exactly? The air in the room had changed texture completely, gone thick and warm and dangerous, the kind of silence that used to happen sometimes back when they were 18 and lying shoulder to shoulder on Julian's roof, both of them staring at stars neither one was actually looking at, both of them aware of every inch of space between their hands and neither one brave enough to close it. You know what it is, Eli said quietly. You've always known. For a moment Julian didn't move. Then he crossed the small distance between them, not fast, not dramatic, just certain, the way a man moves when he's done waiting, and stopped close enough that Eli could feel the warmth coming off him, could see the small scar above his eyebrow from the bike accident when they were 14, could see his own reflection caught in Julian's eyes. Say it, Julian whispered. Say it so I know I'm not imagining this again. I'm in love with you, Eli said. I have been since we were 17. That's why I ran. Julian made a sound that was half laugh, half something breaking loose after years of being held down, and then his hand was at the side of Eli's face, thumb brushing his cheekbone, and the last 6 years folded down into nothing at all. When their lips finally met it wasn't rushed or desperate, it was slow, careful, the kind of kiss that felt like an apology and a promise happening at the same time, Julian's fingers curling gently into Eli's hair, Eli's hand fisting in the front of Julian's shirt like he was afraid this was the kind of thing that could be taken back if he let go. They broke apart, foreheads pressed together, both of them breathing like they'd run the whole 300 miles between Chicago and Cedar Hollow on foot. Don't disappear again, Julian said, barely above a whisper. Whatever this is. Whatever happens next. Don't you dare disappear on me again. Eli didn't answer with words. He answered by staying exactly where he was. To understand how two boys who grew up sharing a fence line ended up standing in a doorway kissing like the world was ending, you'd have to go back to the summer they turned 17, back before Chicago, before silence, before either of them understood what they were so afraid of. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town where everybody's business belonged to everybody else, a town of one blinking traffic light and a Baptist church on every third corner, where the biggest scandal in a given year was usually whose cattle had gotten loose during the county fair. Eli Marsh and Julian Reyes had grown up on opposite sides of a wooden fence that separated their families' backyards, and by the time they were old enough to walk, that fence had more or less stopped functioning as a boundary at all. They built a rope bridge over it when they were 9, using an old garden hose and more optimism than physics. It collapsed within a week, dropping Julian directly into Mrs. Marsh's tomato patch, and Eli had laughed so hard he'd thrown up, and somehow that had only cemented things further instead of ending them. By 11 they had a shared language of inside jokes so dense that their own parents couldn't follow half their conversations. By 14, they were inseparable in the specific, absolute way that only happens once in a person's life, the kind of friendship that doesn't feel like a choice so much as a fact of nature, like gravity, like the sun rising in a particular direction. Julian was the one who talked first, who filled silences before they had a chance to get uncomfortable, who could make a cashier laugh within 10 seconds of meeting them. Eli was quieter, more watchful, the kind of boy who noticed things, the way clouds moved before a storm, the way his mother's voice changed when she was worried but trying not to show it, the way Julian's laugh had two distinct registers depending on whether he actually found something funny or was just trying to make someone else feel better. Nobody in Cedar Hollow thought anything of it, two boys as close as brothers. That's what people called them, brothers, and for a long time that word had fit well enough that neither of them thought to question it. It stopped fitting the summer they turned 17, on a night that started like 100 nights before it and ended like nothing that came after it would ever be quite the same. They were up on the roof of Julian's house, a ritual that had survived from age 12 to 17 without either of them growing tired of it, climbing out through Julian's bedroom window onto the flat stretch of shingles above the back porch. Bringing a battered old blanket and whatever snacks they'd managed to steal from the kitchen, lying there for hours doing nothing more complicated than looking up. "You ever think about after graduation?" Julian had asked that night, chewing on a piece of red licorice, staring straight up at a sky scattered thick with stars the way it only ever got out past the edge of town where the streetlights gave up trying. "Sometimes," Eli said. "You?" "All the time." Julian turned his head, and Eli felt it before he saw it, that particular gravity of being looked at by Julian Reyes when Julian actually meant it. "I think about it a lot, actually. Like, what if we didn't do the whole go our separate ways thing everybody keeps talking about? What if we just didn't? Didn't what? Grow up? Didn't split up?" Julian's voice had gone quieter, more careful than Eli had ever heard it, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd shouted it. "I don't know. Forget it. It's stupid." "It's not stupid." Eli turned his head too, and there it was, the two of them lying inches apart on a rooftop under 100,000 stars, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off Julian's arm, close enough to count his eyelashes in the dark. "I think about it too." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The distance between their hands on the blanket had somehow shrunk to almost nothing, and Eli was aware of every millimeter of it with a clarity that scared him, a physical awareness that had nothing to do with brotherhood and everything to do with something he didn't yet have language for. "Eli." Julian's voice had dropped to something barely above a breath. "Can I tell you something and you promise not to make it weird?" "When have I ever made anything weird?" "I'm serious." Julian propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at him now, and the moonlight caught the side of his face in a way that made something in Eli's chest twist painfully tight. "I think about you. Like, more than I'm supposed to. More than just, best friend stuff." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of something very high up. "Julian. Forget I said anything." Julian rolled back onto his back fast, staring hard at the sky like it owed him an explanation. "Seriously. Pretend I didn't." "I think about you too," Eli said, so fast the words nearly tripped over each other on the way out. "All the time. I didn't think you'd." Julian turned his head again, and this time there was nothing careful about the way he looked at Eli. It was raw, unguarded, 17 years old and terrified and hopeful all at once. His hand found Eli's on the blanket between them, fingers lacing together slow and deliberate, like he was giving Eli every chance in the world to pull away. Eli didn't pull away. They didn't kiss that night. They lay there instead, hands locked together under a sky full of stars, hearts going so hard Eli was sure Julian could hear his from a foot away, both of them too young and too scared to close the last inch of distance between them, but both of them changed all the same, both of them carrying the electric, terrifying knowledge that something had shifted permanently between them and there was no going back to the way things had been. What neither of them knew yet, what neither of them could have possibly guessed, lying there under that wide Cedar Hollow sky, was that this single unfinished moment would end up being the thing that both bound them together and tore them apart. The thing Eli would spend 6 years running from, and the thing Julian would spend 6 years waiting for him to come back to. Because 2 weeks later, everything changed. And it would take 6 long years, 1 broken engagement, 1 dead-end job in Chicago, and 1 impulsive 12-hour drive for either one of them to find their way back to that rooftop, and to each other. 2 weeks after the rooftop, Eli's father was diagnosed with a heart condition that meant, in the blunt language small towns use for these things, he needs to slow down or he isn't going to see 50. The Marsh family owned the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of business that had survived 3 recessions and 1 flood only because Eli's father refused to let it fail, and now here he was being told by a cardiologist in the next county over that his body had finally decided to argue back. Eli remembered the exact moment his mother told him, standing in the kitchen with a dish towel twisted so tight in her hands her knuckles had gone white. He remembered thinking, with the strange clarity that arrives in a crisis, that his whole life had just quietly rearranged itself around a sentence he hadn't asked to hear. "Your father's going to need help with the store," she said. "And there's the community college 2 towns over, you could commute, keep living here, help out on weekends." Or, she hesitated, like she already knew which option he'd take and hated having to say it out loud, "There's still the scholarship. Northwestern. You could still go." Eli had spent that whole spring quietly hoping to get into a journalism program 800 miles away, in a city he'd only seen in photographs, chasing a version of himself that didn't have Cedar Hollow written into every sentence of his biography. He had also spent that whole spring lying on a rooftop holding another boy's hand under the stars, feeling something that terrified him more than any scholarship ever could. Guilt is a strange architect. It builds decisions that look noble on the outside and are actually just fear wearing a nicer coat. Eli told himself, that whole miserable week, that staying to help his father was the right thing to do, the responsible thing, the thing a good son does. He told himself that less and less convincingly every night, because underneath the guilt was something rawer. The rooftop had cracked something open that he didn't know how to close back up, and leaving felt, in some shameful corner of his mind, like an escape hatch he could take without ever having to admit that's what it was. He told Julian he'd decided to go to Northwestern 2 days before he told his parents he'd decided to stay in Cedar Hollow. He never quite explained why he did it in that order, and Julian never quite forgave him for it, though it would take years for either of them to say so out loud. "You're leaving," Julian had said, standing in his driveway, arms crossed so tight against his chest it looked like he was trying to hold himself together physically. 800 miles. After, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "I have to," Eli said, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either. "You don't have to do anything, Eli. You're choosing to." Julian's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that Eli would remember that particular fracture in his voice for the rest of his life. "Was it because of what I said? On the roof? Because if it freaked you out that bad, you could have just told me, you didn't have to." "It's not that." Except it was, at least partly, and they both knew it, and the lie sat between them like a third person in the driveway. "My dad needs the store. My mom needs help. It's not about you." "Everything's about me," Julian said, and it wasn't arrogance in his voice, it was something closer to pleading. "That's the problem, isn't it? You've spent 2 weeks avoiding me since that night and now you're moving 800 miles away and you want me to believe that's a coincidence?" Eli hadn't answered. That silence, the not answering, had said more than any explanation could have, and Julian had looked at him with an expression Eli would spend 6 years trying to forget and never quite managing to. "Fine," Julian said quietly. "Go. But don't call me your brother anymore. Don't you dare call me that, not after everything. You don't get to have it both ways." He'd walked back into his house without another word, and Eli had stood alone in that driveway until the porch light, the same one, the one still broken now, 6 years later, clicked off on its timer and left him standing in the dark. They didn't speak again before Eli left for Chicago. A handful of birthday texts over the years, each one shorter and more distant than the last, until even those stopped. Eli built a life in the city, an apartment, a marketing job he didn't love, a 2-year relationship with a graphic designer named Marcus that ended amicably and without much feeling on either side, the kind of relationship people fall into because it's easier than being alone, not because it's real. He told himself Cedar Hollow was a chapter he'd closed. He told himself a lot of things, that whole 6 years, and most of them turned out to be lies he'd needed at the time to survive. Morning light came into Julian's kitchen in long gold stripes across the wooden table, and Eli sat at it with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching Julian move around the small space with the easy, unconscious confidence of a man in his own home. It had been 3 days since Eli's suitcase landed in that living room, 3 days of a strange, careful, electric domesticity neither of them had planned for and neither of them wanted to examine too closely, in case examining it made it disappear. "You're staring," Julian said without turning around, flipping a pancake with a confidence that suggested this wasn't his first attempt at winning Eli over through breakfast. "I'm thinking. About? About how you learned to cook. You used to burn cereal." Julian laughed, that same unchanged laugh, and slid a plate in front of Eli, pancake stacked slightly crooked, dusted with too much powdered sugar, clearly made with more enthusiasm than technique. "A man's gotta grow, Eli. Some of us didn't run off to Chicago to reinvent ourselves. Some of us just quietly got better at pancakes." The comment landed lighter than it could have, but Eli still felt the small hook buried in it, the old wound Julian couldn't quite help touching even now, 3 days and 1 kiss into whatever this was becoming. He set his fork down. "I know I have some things to answer for," Eli said. "I'm not trying to pretend 6 years didn't happen. I know." Julian sat down across from him, suddenly serious, the playfulness draining out of his face like a tide going out. "I'm not trying to punish you for it. Sometimes it slips out sideways before I can stop it. I'm working on it. You have every right to be angry. I'm not angry anymore. I was angry for about 4 years. Somewhere around year 5 I got tired and just started being sad instead." Julian said it simply, without self-pity, the way you'd report the weather, and somehow that made it worse to hear. "And now you're back, and some mornings I wake up and think I dreamed the whole thing. That you're not actually in my kitchen eating bad pancakes. That I made it up because I wanted it so bad." Eli reached across the table and took his hand, thumb brushing over his knuckles, and felt the same electric jolt he'd felt 3 nights ago in the doorway, except this time it settled instead of startled him, this time it felt like coming to rest somewhere he'd been circling for years without realizing it. "I'm not going anywhere," Eli said. "You said that before you left the first time too," Julian said quietly. Not cruel. Just honest, in the specific unguarded way only Julian had ever been honest with him. "I need you to understand that I can't just take your word for it this time. I need you to actually stay and show me." "I will. I hope so." Julian squeezed his hand once, then let go, and picked his fork back up like the moment hadn't just cracked something open between them again. "Eat your pancakes. They're getting cold and I put real effort into these, unlike your Chicago croissants." Eli laughed despite himself, and the tension in the kitchen loosened just slightly, enough for both of them to breathe again, enough to remember they still knew how to be easy with each other even now, even with 6 years of unfinished business sitting at the table between them like an uninvited guest. The trouble arrived, as trouble in small towns always does, with a name and a face and a history, Marcus. Not the Marcus from Chicago, a different one, a hometown Marcus, though the coincidence of the name would strike Eli later as almost too cruel to be funny. This Marcus had been 2 years ahead of them in school, had gone to the same community college Eli's mother once suggested, and had apparently spent the last 3 years dating Julian on and off, in the vague, unfinished way small towns allow relationships to exist without anyone having to commit to calling them anything specific. Eli found out about him the way you find out about anything in Cedar Hollow, from his mother, over dinner, delivered with the particular innocent cruelty of someone who has no idea they're detonating a bomb. "I saw Julian at the 4th of July thing last summer," his mother said, passing the mashed potatoes. "He was with that Delgado boy. Marcus. You remember him, played baseball, dated your cousin's friend for a while. They looked awfully cozy, if you ask me." Eli set his fork down very carefully. "They're together?" "Oh, I don't know, honey, you know how young people are these days, nobody tells anybody anything anymore." His mother waved a hand, oblivious to the way Eli's expression had gone very still. "Why? You seeing a lot of Julian since you got back?" "A bit," Eli said, which was the understatement of his entire life, and excused himself from the table 10 minutes later with a headache that was really something closer to panic wearing a physical disguise. He didn't ask Julian about it that night, or the night after. He told himself he was giving Julian space to bring it up himself, but the truth, the uglier truth underneath the polite one, was that Eli was scared of the answer, scared that the 6 years he'd spent running had cost him more than time, that somewhere in that gap Julian had built a life with room for someone else in it, someone who hadn't left, someone who'd actually shown up when it mattered. The silence between them thickened over the following days in small, almost imperceptible ways. Eli started finding reasons to be busy, helping his mother sort through boxes in the attic, taking longer walks than necessary, texting back an hour late instead of 5 minutes. Julian noticed. Julian always noticed things, that was the terrifying thing about him, he'd always been able to read Eli like a book with the cover half torn off. "You've been weird for 3 days, Julian said finally, cornering him, not literally, but it felt that way, on the back porch one evening, the same porch, the same crooked steps they used to sit on as kids. "Did I do something?" "No. It's not you. That's what people say right before they mean, it's absolutely you." Julian crossed his arms, and Eli recognized the posture from the driveway 6 years ago, the same defensive shape a person makes when they're bracing for another disappearance. "Talk to me, Eli. Whatever it is." Eli hesitated. And in that hesitation, that half-second where he chose careful silence over honest fear, he watched something in Julian's face close off, like a shutter coming down over a window, like Julian had decided, in real time, to stop hoping for an answer he could already tell wasn't coming easily. "Forget it," Julian said, and there was a coldness in his voice Eli had never heard directed at him before, not once in 20 years of knowing him. "You know what, forget I asked. I'm used to this part anyway. This is usually right around when you disappear." "Julian. No, it's fine." He was already backing toward the door, already putting distance between them with his whole body, the way he used to put distance between his feet and the edge of the roof when he was scared of heights as a kid. "I get it. I just thought maybe this time was different." The door shut behind him, not slammed, which was somehow worse than if it had been, a quiet, deliberate close, the sound of a man protecting himself instead of a man losing his temper, and Eli stood alone on the porch in the fading light, staring at the same fence line he'd climbed over 1,000 times as a boy, and understood with a sick, sinking certainty that he was about to lose Julian all over again. This time for a reason far stupider than heart conditions and scholarships, he was about to lose him because he was too afraid to ask a simple question and hear whatever answer came back. He thought about the rooftop. He thought about 6 years of birthday texts getting shorter and shorter until they stopped. He thought about a boy who had once said "I think about you, more than I'm supposed to," and had waited, alone in this house, for 6 long years for Eli to find his way back to those words. And then, before he could talk himself out of it the way he had every single time before, Eli opened the door and walked back inside. "His name is Marcus," Eli said, before Julian could even turn around, before his own courage could evaporate the way it always had before. "The guy my mom saw you with at the 4th of July thing. I've known for 3 days and I've been too scared to ask you about it because I'm terrified you're going to tell me it's serious, and I don't think I'd survive finding out I came back too late." Julian went very still in the middle of the kitchen, dish towel forgotten in his hands. That's what this has been about, he said slowly. 3 days of you going weird and quiet, and it's about Marcus Delgado. I know it's stupid. It's not stupid, it's just, Julian let out a breath that was almost a laugh, disbelieving, exhausted, something dangerously close to relief. Eli. Marcus and I went on maybe 6 dates over 2 years. It ended in March because I couldn't stop comparing every single person I dated to a guy who left for Chicago and never called. There is no Marcus. There's never really been anyone, not really, not since you. The kitchen went quiet in that same loaded way it had the first night, the air gone thick and charged, and Eli crossed the space between them without deciding to, the way water finds its way downhill without needing permission. I'm sorry, Eli said, forehead resting against Julian's. I'm sorry I let 6 years of fear turn into 3 days of being an idiot about a guy who isn't even in the picture. You're gonna have to get a lot better at this, Julian murmured, arms coming up around him. The talking. The not running. I need you to actually be bad at leaving from now on. I can work with that, Eli said, and kissed him, slow, certain, no longer careful in the fragile, testing way it had been 3 nights before, but something steadier now, something that felt less like an apology and more like a decision both of them were finally, fully making. But even as their world narrowed back down to just the two of them in that small kitchen, neither of them noticed the headlights sweeping briefly across the front window, a car slowing outside, then continuing on, carrying someone who would, in a matter of days, walk back into both their lives and force them to confront the one part of their history neither of them had ever fully resolved, what it meant. In a town like Cedar Hollow, for 2 men to choose each other out loud. The car that had slowed outside Julian's window that night belonged, as it turned out, to Julian's older sister, Renata, who arrived unannounced 2 days later with a casserole dish in one hand and an expression that made it very clear she had opinions and intended to share them. So, she said, setting the dish down on the kitchen counter with the deliberate calm of a woman defusing a bomb, Mom wants to know if it's true. Julian went very still. Eli, standing at the sink with a coffee mug he'd been washing for far longer than a mug requires, felt his stomach drop through the floor. If what's true, Julian said carefully. Don't do that. Don't, if what's true of me, Julian Andres Reyes, I have known you since you were born. Renata crossed her arms, but her eyes weren't hard, if anything, they looked tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has been holding a family's worth of unspoken things for a very long time. Cheryl Owens saw you two at the diner Sunday morning. Holding hands across the table like a couple of teenagers. In Cedar Hollow. Where everybody's grandmother eats breakfast. The silence that followed felt like the entire kitchen had turned to glass. It's true, Julian said finally, and he said it steady, chin up, in the voice of a man who had decided a long time ago that he would not spend his whole life apologizing for who he loved, even if the decision cost him something. It's true, and I'm not sorry, and if Mom has a problem with it she can say so to my face instead of sending you to do reconnaissance. Renata's face did something complicated then, something that moved through surprise and worry and finally settled, unexpectedly, into something gentler. Nobody sent me to do reconnaissance, idiot. Mom's not upset. Mom cried, actually, but the good kind, the kind she did at your college graduation. She's just scared for you. This town isn't Chicago. Her eyes flicked to Eli. No offense. None taken, Eli said quietly, though something in his chest had tightened at the reminder of exactly what kind of place they were choosing to be together in, a town of one blinking light and long memories, where old men still argued at the diner counter about things that happened decades ago, where a rumor could travel from one end of Main Street to the other before the coffee went cold. I just want to know you've thought about it, Renata said, softer now, directing the words at her brother but including Eli in the sweep of her gaze. Really thought about it. Because loving each other quietly in a kitchen is easy. Loving each other where people can see you, where Pastor Dale can see you, where your boss at the feed store can see you, that's a different kind of brave. I need to know you're both ready for that, because I watched you fall apart once already over this exact thing, and I am not doing that again." The words landed heavier than she probably meant them to, and Eli felt Julian go tense beside him, the old wound flaring under new pressure. It was one thing to reconcile in the privacy of a kitchen with the blinds half drawn. It was another thing entirely to imagine walking down Main Street hand in hand, to imagine his mother hearing about it from a neighbor before hearing it from him, to imagine every single version of judgment this town was capable of manufacturing. Eli set the mug down. "I've thought about it," he said, surprising himself with how sure his voice came out. "I spent 6 years running from exactly this conversation, Renata. I'm not running from it again. Whatever it costs." Renata studied him for a long moment, the way you study someone you're deciding whether to trust, and then, apparently satisfied, she picked her purse back up off the counter. "Good. Then eat the casserole, both of you, you look like you've been living on pancakes and denial." She paused at the door, glancing back with something almost like a smile tugging at her mouth. For what it's worth, Julian never really believed anyone else. Not once, not really, not in 6 years. "I just needed to hear that you were worth the wait." The door closed behind her, and the kitchen exhaled. Word moved through Cedar Hollow the way it always did, not maliciously, mostly, but thoroughly, the way weather moves through a valley whether anyone invites it or not. By the following week, Eli's mother had heard it from 3 separate sources before Eli found the courage to sit her down himself, and though she cried, too, and though she needed several days and a long walk around the block to fully absorb it, she showed up on Julian's porch 9 days later with a pie and an apology for not saying something kind sooner. Not everyone was as gentle. There were looks at the hardware store that lingered a beat too long. There was a comment overheard outside the church that Eli chose not to repeat to Julian, because repeating it would have given it more power than it deserved. There was, on one particularly hard Tuesday, a customer who requested a different clerk the moment he recognized Eli behind the counter, and Eli had gone into the back room afterward and stood very still against the cool metal shelving for several minutes, breathing through something that felt uncomfortably close to the fear that had sent him running 800 miles in the first place. Julian found him there. "Hey," Julian said softly, not touching him yet, just standing close enough that Eli could feel his presence like warmth radiating off a fire. "I heard what happened out there. I'm fine. You don't have to be fine. Not with me." Julian leaned against the shelving beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the same easy physical closeness they'd had as boys, except everything underneath it had changed now, deepened, become something neither of them needed to hide from anymore. "This is the part one was scared of too, you know. It doesn't get less hard just because we decided to be brave about it." "I keep thinking I'm about to lose my nerve," Eli admitted quietly. "Not about you. Never about you. About all of this, the town, the looks, my dad's old customers who are gonna talk about me the same way they used to talk about the Delgado boy who left for the city and came back different. I ran once already because I was scared of exactly this." Julian turned to face him fully, taking both of Eli's hands in his, steady and certain. "Then let's be scared together instead of scared apart. That's the whole difference, Eli. Last time you carried it alone and decided for both of us. This time, whatever happens, the stares, the whispers, whatever Pastor Dale has to say about it on a Sunday, we carry it together. I'm not asking you to not be scared. I'm asking you to not disappear when you are." Eli felt something settle in his chest, something that had been circling and unsteady for 6 long years finally coming to rest. "Okay," he said. "Together." "Together," Julian repeated, and kissed him right there in the stockroom, gentle and unhurried, like a promise being sealed instead of tested. The real test came a month later, at the Cedar Hollow Fall Festival, an event so deeply woven into the town's identity that missing it wasn't really an option for anyone whose family had lived there more than one generation. Main Street closed to traffic. Folding tables lined the sidewalks with jars of preserves and handmade crafts. The volunteer fire department grilled corn on the same rusted grills they'd used for 20 years, and somewhere near the gazebo, a local band that was really just four guys from the feed store played covers slightly out of tune. Eli hadn't been to the festival in 6 years. Standing at the edge of it now, watching the familiar chaos of his childhood unfold in front of him, the same string lights, the same overpriced funnel cake stand, the same faces aged 6 years but otherwise unchanged, he felt Julian's hand find his without either of them discussing it first, a small, deliberate act of visibility neither of them had fully practiced yet in front of the whole town at once. They walked the length of Main Street like that, hand in hand, past the hardware store where Eli's father still worked the register some mornings, past the diner where Cheryl Owens had started the rumor mill in the first place, past faces that ranged from indifferent to curious to, in a handful of cases, openly disapproving. Eli felt every single glance like a physical weight, and every single time his instinct rose up to let go of Julian's hand and disappear into the crowd the way the old Eli would have, he made the small, deliberate choice to hold on tighter instead. It was outside the church tent, of all places, that the confrontation finally came, an older man Eli vaguely recognized from Sunday services years ago, stepping into their path with an expression that had clearly been rehearsing something for weeks. "Didn't think I'd live to see this on Main Street," the man said, loud enough that a small cluster of festival-goers nearby went quiet, waiting to see what happened next. Two boys from good families, carrying on like this in front of the old Eli would have apologized. The old Eli would have dropped Julian's hand, made himself small, found some way to smooth it over and disappear. But something had shifted permanently in him over the last month, something built out of 6 years of running and one long overdue homecoming, and instead he simply looked the man in the eye and said, quietly but without a single trace of apology in his voice, "We're not carrying on, sir. We're just walking down Main Street holding hands, the same as anybody else here today. It ain't natural." With respect, Julian cut in, calm and steady, his grip on Eli's hand never wavering. "We've both spent our whole lives in this town. Our families built half the businesses on this street. We're not asking for anything except to walk through our own hometown without hiding who we love. If that's a problem for you, that's yours to work out, not ours." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently unprepared for two young men who weren't going to shrink themselves down to make him more comfortable. He muttered something under his breath and walked off toward the church tent, and for a moment the small crowd around them held its breath, uncertain which way the moment would break. Then, unexpectedly, an older woman from the crowd, Mrs. Alvarez, who had taught both of them in Sunday school 2 decades earlier, stepped forward, patted Eli's arm, and said simply, "Don't you let old Frank ruin your festival, sweetheart. Your mother's over by the pie table crying happy tears, in case you wanted to know. Go say hello." The tension broke like a held breath finally released. A few people smiled. A few looked away, uncomfortable but not unkind, and the ordinary noise of the festival swallowed the moment back up, the band starting a new song, the smell of funnel cake drifting over from the stand, life simply continuing the way it always does even after the moments that feel, in the middle of them, like they might break everything apart. Eli found his mother by the pie table exactly where Mrs. Alvarez said she'd be, eyes bright, and she pulled him into a hug that said more than either of them needed words for. Over her shoulder, Eli caught Julian's eye, and Julian smiled at him, that same unchanged, unguarded smile from 100 summer nights on a rooftop, and Eli understood, with a certainty that settled all the way down into his bones, that whatever it cost to stay, this was worth every single bit of it. That night, after the festival lights had dimmed and the town had folded itself back into its ordinary quiet rhythms, Eli and Julian climbed back onto the roof of Julian's childhood home, the same house Julian had bought, the same window, the same flat stretch of shingles above the back porch where two 17-year-old boys had once held hands under the stars and been too scared to finish what they'd started. 6 years, Julian said, lying back against the same worn blanket, hands laced with Eli's exactly the way they had been that first night. "Feels like it took forever and no time at all, somehow. I'm sorry it took me this long," Eli said, staring up at the same wide sky, the same stars, unchanged the way only the sky in a small town can stay unchanged while everything underneath it transforms completely. I keep wanting to go back and shake some sense into 17-year-old me. Don't. Julian turned his head, and Eli felt the familiar gravity of being looked at fully, completely, the way only Julian had ever looked at him. If you'd stayed then, we'd have been kids trying to figure out something we weren't ready for yet. Maybe we needed the 6 years. Maybe we needed to become the people who could actually handle what happened outside that church tent today, instead of running from it. Since when did you get wise? Since I spent 6 years missing you and had a lot of time to think, Julian said, and there was no bitterness in it now, just a quiet, hard-won peace. I'm not saying I'd choose to do it again. I'm just saying maybe it wasn't wasted time. Maybe it was just the long way home. Eli propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at him the way Julian had looked down at him 6 years earlier, moonlight catching the same small scar above his eyebrow, and felt the entire weight of everything they'd survived to get to this exact moment settle into something that finally felt like peace instead of fear. I love you, he said. Not the scared, 17-year-old, too afraid to finish the sentence version. All the way. Out loud. In front of the whole town, if that's what it takes. I love you too, Julian said, voice thick with everything 6 years apart had cost them both. Welcome home, Eli. This time, when their lips met, there was nothing unfinished about it at all. Months later, when people in Cedar Hollow talk about the Marsh boy and the Reyes boy, because people always find a new way to talk, that never really changes, the story has softened into something almost fond, the way small towns eventually absorb the things that once scandalized them into just another thread of local history. Frank from the church tent still doesn't wave when he passes them on Main Street. But Mrs. Alvarez brings them a pie every Christmas, and Eli's mother has a photo of the two of them on her mantle now, right next to Eli's baby pictures, like it was always simply meant to be there. The porch light at Julian's house finally got fixed. Eli did it himself, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, standing on a stepladder while Julian handed him tools and made fun of his technique the way he used to make fun of his pancakes. It doesn't flicker anymore. It just stays on, steady, every single night, guiding anyone who needs to find their way home. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you felt during